The icy wind howled through the streets of Washington, D.C. as Emily Carter pulled her worn-out coat tighter around her shoulders, bracing against the cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. Just a year ago, she had walked with purpose, a decorated combat medic in the United States Army, someone who had saved lives on the battlefield, made split-second decisions under fire, and led soldiers through the chaos of war. She had been fearless, strong, unshakable. But today, none of that mattered. Today, she was just another name on a list, another veteran struggling to be seen in a world that had moved on without her. With a stack of resumes clutched tightly in her gloved hands, she stared up at the gleaming glass tower before her, the latest in a string of corporate offices where she had applied for work. The interviews were always the same polite nods, forced smiles, and the inevitable rejection. As she stepped inside, the receptionist barely glanced at her before gesturing toward the waiting area, her eyes flicking briefly over Emily's simple clothes, her lack of an expensive briefcase or tailored suit speaking louder than words. Minutes later, she sat across from a hiring manager, a man with a sleek watch and an expression carefully crafted to appear sympathetic, though his decision had already been made. He flipped through her resume with the air of someone skimming a page of an old book they had no intention of finishing. "You have an impressive background," he said, his tone mechanical, rehearsed. "But we're really looking for someone with corporate experience. Military services, well, different." The word echoed in Emily's mind like a gunshot. Different. She forced a polite smile, the same one she had practiced 100 times before. "I've managed emergency operations under extreme pressure, coordinated evacuations, trained medics, and led teams in unpredictable, high-stress environments. I think those skills are highly transferable to leadership and problem-solving in any industry." The hiring manager barely looked up. "I understand, but corporate culture is different. You know, team collaboration, adapting to fast-paced environments, understanding workplace dynamics." Emily inhaled slowly, biting back the words that threatened to spill from her lips. "I've worked in war zones. I've kept people alive in the middle of chaos. And you're telling me I can't handle an office job?" But she already knew it wouldn't matter. The interview ended with a handshake that lacked any real sincerity, and a closing line that she had come to recognize as a well-mannered dismissal. "We'll be in touch." As she stepped out into the biting wind once more, her fists clenched in frustration, the city moving around her like she was invisible, she knew she had reached the end of the line. Her savings were gone. Her apartment was already lost. And now, the last remnants of hope she had been clinging to were slipping through her fingers like sand. She sat down on a cold park bench across from the White House, staring at the grand symbol of the country she had risked everything for, wondering how it had come to this. She had given everything to her country, her time, her strength, her youth. And now she had nothing. No job, no home, no future. As she pulled a crumpled dollar bill from her pocket, debating whether to buy a meal or save it for a bus ride, she felt the weight of exhaustion press down on her like an anchor. Then a thought flickered to life in the back of her mind, small at first, but growing stronger with every passing second. This isn't over. Tomorrow, President Donald Trump was holding a live press conference at the Capitol, surrounded by the country's most powerful figures and the National Press Corps. It was a long shot, maybe even reckless, but it was the only shot she had left. No more emails. No more ignored applications. No more being dismissed with a single glance at her resume. She wasn't going to let them overlook her anymore. Tomorrow, she was going to stand up in front of the entire nation, look the President of the United States in the eye, and ask for what she had fought for her entire life a chance. She had nothing left to lose. The early morning air was crisp, filled with the hum of Washington, D.C.'s ever-moving energy. Emily Carter had barely slept, her mind racing with every possible outcome of what she was about to do. She had faced danger before: enemy fire, chaotic rescue missions, life and death decisions in the field, but none of it compared to the overwhelming uncertainty she felt now. Standing outside the grand venue where President Trump's press conference was set to take place, she tightened her grip on the straps of her backpack, her breath steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. The entrance was heavily guarded, Secret Service agents posted at every doorway, their sharp eyes scanning the growing crowd of journalists, politicians, and media personnel who moved with an air of belonging. Emily, on the other hand, was an outsider. She had no press credentials, no invitation, no connections, just an unwavering determination that kept her rooted in place. She watched as reporters from major networks adjusted their cameras and reviewed their notes, their voices a mix of hurried excitement and anticipation. The conference would cover everything from economic policies to military funding, but to Emily, none of that mattered. All she cared about was getting inside. The closer she got to the entrance, the more her pulse quickened. Just then, a firm voice snapped her out of her thoughts. "Miss, press credentials?" A security officer, tall and broad-shouldered, blocked her path, his expression neutral but firm. Emily hesitated for only a moment before responding. "I'm a veteran," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "I need to speak to the president." The officer's brow furrowed slightly, his gaze assessing her. "Ma'am, this is a high-security event. No unauthorized personnel." Her heart pounded, but she refused to back down. "I've spent years serving this country. I've led teams, saved lives, made sacrifices most people can't imagine. And now that I need help, no one will even look at me." She took a deep breath, her eyes locking onto his. "I need to ask the president one question." Just one. The silence between them was heavy. The officer's jaw tightened, a flicker of something understanding, maybe even respect crossing his face. "You served?" he asked after a pause. "U.S. Army combat medic," she answered. Another pause. The officer sighed, glancing over his shoulder before stepping slightly to the side. "Last row. Stay quiet. If anyone asks, you didn't hear it from me." Emily didn't hesitate. She slipped past him, her heart hammering in her chest as she entered the grand conference hall. Rows of chairs stretched toward the elevated stage, where the presidential seal stood at the podium. Cameras lined the back of the room, their red recording lights flickering. She found a seat in the last row, her hands gripping the armrests as she tried to steady her breathing. The energy in the room was electric. Every movement, every glance, every murmur of conversation reminded her that this was bigger than anything she had ever done before. Minutes later, a hush fell over the room. The side doors opened, and President Donald Trump walked in, flanked by aides and high-ranking officials. The room erupted in a frenzy. Camera shutters clicked rapidly. Reporters stood, microphones were adjusted, and questions were prepared. Trump moved with his usual confidence, stepping up to the podium and scanning the crowd. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice cutting through the air with authority. Emily could barely hear the first few statements as her thoughts roared in her head. She had made it inside. But now came the real test. The press conference unfolded as expected: questions about policy, foreign relations, the economy. Trump responded with his characteristic directness, sometimes serious, sometimes dismissive, sometimes commanding. The event was nearing its end, and Emily could feel her window of opportunity closing. Then came the final question. A journalist stood, ready to ask about trade negotiations. Trump answered briefly, then shifted, preparing to leave the stage. This was it. Before she could talk herself out of it, Emily shot to her feet. "Mr. President." Her voice rang out, sharp and clear, cutting through the polished voices of professional reporters. The room froze. Heads turned in unison. Camera lenses shifted toward her. A murmur rippled through the audience as security tensed, eyes locking onto her. No one, not even seasoned White House journalists, was allowed to disrupt the press conference this way. On stage, Trump stopped mid-step. Slowly, he turned back toward the podium, his expression unreadable as his gaze landed on her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying an edge of curiosity. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat, knowing there was no turning back now. She lifted her chin, steadied her breath, and spoke with every ounce of courage she had left. "My name is Emily Carter. I served as a combat medic in the United States Army, and I need a job." The room fell into absolute silence. You could have heard a pin drop. Trump tilted his head slightly, studying her with a piercing gaze. For a moment, no one spoke, no one moved. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the president leaned forward, gripping the podium with both hands. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and steady. "What did you just say?" The weight of silence pressed down on the room like a force of nature. Every journalist, every advisor, every official seated in the press conference held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of movement, every tightening of expression. Emily Carter stood her ground, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. But she didn't waver. She had come too far to back down now. President Trump, his hands gripping the podium, studied her for a long moment. His expression was unreadable, half curiosity, half measured calculation. Then, finally, he spoke. "Say that again," he commanded, his voice low, but carrying the weight of authority. Emily straightened her spine, ignoring the tension that radiated from every corner of the room. "My name is Emily Carter," she repeated, louder this time. "I served as a combat medic in the United States Army. I did my part. I fought for this country. And when I came home, I was forgotten. The system that should have helped me turned its back. The companies that claimed to honor veterans shut their doors in my face. I've applied for over 100 jobs, Mr. President, and I've been rejected from every single one." A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Some reporters stole glances at each other, their fingers flying across keyboards as they scrambled to document this unprecedented moment. The entire press conference had just been derailed by a single unexpected challenge. Trump narrowed his eyes. "You're telling me that after serving your country, after putting your life on the line, you can't find a job?" Emily clenched her fists, her voice steady despite the emotions burning inside her. "That's exactly what I'm telling you, sir." The murmurs in the room grew louder, turning into hushed whispers of shock. Journalists scribbled notes furiously, sensing that this was no ordinary exchange. This was a moment that would define the press conference, and possibly much more. Trump let out a slow breath, tapping his fingers against the podium. "And what do you want me to do about it?" The question wasn't dismissive. It was a challenge, a test. Emily could feel it in the way he looked at her, measuring her response. She swallowed hard but met his gaze head-on. "I want you to help me," she said, her voice firm. "Not just me. Every veteran like me. The ones who come home and have to fight a new battle just to survive. I want you to hold these companies accountable when they say they support veterans, but refuse to hire them. I want you to fix a system that treats us like we're disposable." For the first time since she had spoken, Trump glanced at his advisors. Some looked uncomfortable. Others were already jotting down notes, anticipating that this would be a topic they'd be dealing with for days, if not weeks. He turned back to Emily, exhaling sharply. "You're standing here, calling me out in front of every camera in the country," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable mix of amusement and challenge. "That takes guts." Emily's stomach tightened. She wasn't here for compliments. She was here for answers. "I didn't come here to disrespect you, Mr. President," she said, her tone unwavering. "I came here because you're the only one powerful enough to change this. And if I have to stand in this room and say it in front of the world, then that's what I'll do." Another wave of hushed whispers rippled through the room. The tension in the air was electric. The confrontation had turned into something bigger than anyone had expected. Trump was silent for a moment, considering her words. Then he did something that stunned everyone in the room. He stepped back from the podium, folded his arms, and nodded. "All right," he said simply. "Come up here." The room gasped. Reporters froze. Cameras clicked at a furious pace, capturing the moment from every possible angle. Emily hesitated for only a second before moving. Her legs felt heavy, her nerves screaming at her, but she pushed forward, weaving through rows of seated journalists, all of whom stared at her as though she had just defied gravity. She reached the steps leading to the stage, her heartbeat a deafening roar in her ears. Two Secret Service agents stiffened, their hands subtly shifting toward their earpieces, waiting for a signal. But Trump waved them off. Emily climbed the steps and stood beside him. She had imagined this moment in 100 different ways, but none of them felt as surreal as this. Trump turned toward the audience, gesturing toward her. "This woman served her country," he said, his voice strong and unwavering. "And now she's telling me, right here, that the country she fought for has abandoned her." He turned to Emily. "You wanted to ask me something. Now you're standing right here. So ask me again. What do you want?" Emily took a breath, steadied herself, and spoke. "I want change." The room was thick with tension, a moment suspended in time as every camera, every journalist, every pair of eyes focused on Emily Carter and President Trump standing side by side on the stage. Emily could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she didn't waver. She had fought battles before on the field, in emergency triage, and in the civilian world that had pushed her aside. This was just another battle, one where words, not bullets, would determine the outcome. Trump studied her, his gaze sharp, calculating. "You want change," he repeated, his voice slow, deliberate. "That's a nice sentiment. But what exactly do you think I can do for you? What do you think I should do for every veteran who finds themselves in your position?" Emily took a steadying breath. "It starts with action, Mr. President. Companies claim they support veterans, but their hiring practices say otherwise. Job training programs exist, but they don't reach the veterans who need them most. And when veterans struggle with the transition back into civilian life, they're left on their own. No one is tracking where they go, whether they get jobs, whether they have the resources to start over. We are abandoned, Mr. President, by a system that promises to have our backs, but disappears the moment we take off the uniform." Trump's lips pressed into a thin line as he nodded, his expression unreadable. He turned toward the audience, scanning the room full of journalists who had fallen completely silent, their pens motionless over their notepads. "You hear that?" he asked them, gesturing toward Emily. "This woman served her country. She did everything we ask our soldiers to do. She put her life on the line, and when she came back, she found herself locked out of the system she fought to protect. That's not how this country is supposed to work." Emily held her ground as Trump turned back to her. "So tell me, Emily," he said, his tone shifting, growing more intense. "What do you think would fix this? You want accountability? Fine. I'll give you the floor. Tell me what needs to change." Emily's throat tightened. This was it, the moment she had fought to create. She took a deep breath and let her words flow. Veterans need guaranteed pathways to employment when they return, she said firmly. A direct transition program that places service members into jobs before they even leave the military. We don't need handouts, we need access. Instead of forcing veterans to navigate a maze of red tape, employers should be required to dedicate a percentage of their workforce to hiring qualified veterans. We need to reform the GI Bill so that it covers trade schools and small business grants just as much as it covers college degrees. Not every veteran wants to sit in a classroom for 4 years. We need options. And above all, we need oversight. A real system that holds corporations and government agencies accountable when they fail the people who fought for this country. Her voice was steady, unwavering. As she spoke, she could see some of the reporters nodding, their eyes flickering with something that looked dangerously close to agreement. The weight of the moment settled over the room like a dense fog. Even Trump's advisors, usually quick to step in and manage the situation, sat frozen in their seats, watching. Trump exhaled sharply and turned back to the audience. "You hear that?" he said again. "That's the sound of someone who actually knows what she's talking about." There was a beat of silence before he turned back to Emily, his expression more serious now. "All right," he said. "Let's do something about it." The room erupted into chaos. Journalists surged forward, cameras flashing wildly, the sound of shutters clicking in rapid succession. Voices overlapped as reporters shouted questions, trying to make sense of what had just happened. This wasn't just a headline, it was history unfolding before their eyes. Emily barely had time to process what had been said before Trump was already moving, turning toward one of his senior advisors. "Get the Secretary of Labor on the phone," he ordered. "I want to know exactly what's in place for veteran employment programs and what isn't working." The advisor blinked in shock before scrambling to pull out his phone. Another aide leaned in, whispering something to Trump, but he waved them off. "I don't care what the bureaucrats think," he snapped. "This is the problem. We've got too many people talking and not enough people doing. If the system is broken, we fix it." Emily felt like the floor had shifted beneath her feet. Was this really happening? Was the President of the United States actually listening to her? Trump turned back to her. "You wanted action," he said. "I'm giving you a seat at the table. You're going to work with my administration to make sure veterans like you aren't forgotten." That's not a request. That's an order. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had fought for this moment, pushed for it with everything she had. And now, standing here, hearing the president say those words, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The press conference was no longer about the economy, foreign policy, or political talking points. It had become something much bigger. It had become a turning point. And for the first time in a long time, Emily Carter felt like she wasn't just another forgotten soldier. She was a voice, a force. And she wasn't going to stop now. The moment was unlike anything Emily Carter had ever experienced. The flash of cameras, the rising hum of voices, the energy in the room. She wasn't just standing in a press conference anymore. She was standing at the edge of something much bigger, something that could change the lives of thousands, maybe millions, of veterans just like her. Her entire life, she had been trained to push forward, to adapt, to fight for what mattered. And now, for the first time since she had left the military, she wasn't fighting alone. President Trump's words still echoed in her ears. "You wanted action. I'm giving you a seat at the table." It was more than a response, it was a challenge. And Emily Carter didn't back down from challenges. She had fought in war zones, seen brothers and sisters in arms sacrifice everything for a country that had forgotten them once they came home. Not anymore. Not if she had anything to say about it. As the press conference ended and the room buzzed with chaos, Advisors and officials swarmed Trump, throwing policies and logistics at him, questioning his decision. "Mr. President, this isn't how things are done," one of them argued. Trump barely acknowledged him. "Then maybe it's time we stop doing things the same way," he shot back before turning to Emily. "We're starting now. Are you ready for this?" Emily met his gaze without hesitation. "I was born ready." What followed was nothing short of a political earthquake. Within hours, every major news outlet had picked up the story. Headlines blared across screens. Trump's unprecedented move to fix the veteran crisis. Veteran challenges Trump on jobs. His response shakes the nation. Emily Carter, from the battlefield to the White House. Social media exploded, with millions of people sharing clips of the moment she stood up and demanded change. Some hailed it as one of the boldest moves in modern politics. Others called it a publicity stunt. But Emily didn't care about the headlines. She cared about what came next. By the next morning, Emily found herself seated at a massive oak conference table in the White House, surrounded by policymakers, economists, and military officials. This wasn't a symbolic meeting. It was real. She had a folder full of research, a list of solutions, and one goal: to make sure no veteran would ever have to go through what she had. She didn't just sit in those meetings, she owned them. When officials tried to drown her in bureaucratic language, she cut through it with facts. When they hesitated on reforms, she reminded them of the people they were supposed to be serving. And when resistance came, and it did come, she fought with the same determination she had on the battlefield. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, real change began to take shape. A new veteran employment initiative was launched, guaranteeing transitioning service members a direct path into civilian jobs. Major corporations signed pledges to hire a percentage of veterans, backed by tax incentives. The Department of Veterans Affairs underwent a complete overhaul, streamlining the claims process that had left so many waiting years for basic benefits. Emily was at the heart of it all. And then, 1 year to the day after she had stood up in that press conference, she found herself back in front of the cameras, but this time, not as a desperate veteran looking for a chance. She stood at the podium in the White House, with President Trump at her side, as he announced the most significant reforms to veteran care in decades. When it was her turn to speak, she looked out at the sea of faces: journalists, politicians, veterans who had once lost hope. Her voice was clear, unwavering. 1 year ago, I walked into a press conference as just another veteran struggling to be heard. Today, I stand before you to say this: we are not forgotten. We are not broken. We are not a burden. We are the backbone of this country, and it is about time we were treated as such. To every veteran out there who thinks the system has abandoned them, hold on. Change is here. And to anyone who ever doubted what a single voice could do, let this be proof. One voice can start a movement. And a movement can change the world. The room erupted into applause. Some stood. Others wiped their eyes. But the only thing Emily focused on was the overwhelming feeling that, for the first time in years, things were finally right. As she stepped away from the podium, President Trump leaned toward her and smirked. "You were right," he said. "We needed someone like you," Emily smiled. "No, Mr. President. We needed all of us." And with that, the battle she had fought so hard for was won, not just for her, but for every veteran who had ever been told they weren't enough. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more. What's a moment in your life where you learned a lesson the hard way? Share it in the comments below.